started in hard times to bring us all in, into the laughter through thick and through thin, for public power enthusiasts without end.
I'm Paul Dockery, a Senior Manager of Energy Resource Strategy and Planning for Seattle City Light and an energy enthusiast.
I'm Conleigh Byers, an Environmental Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School of Government, researching grid decarbonization and electricity market design.
I'm Farhad Billimoria, a Director in Electricity Markets for S&P Global and a Visiting Research Fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies.
And Almaz is out this week, so joining Conleigh, Farhad, and I in her stead is Matthew Schroettnig. Matt is the Vice President of Policy and Legal Affairs at Northwest Requirements Utilities, and Executive Producer of Public Power Underground, and just a frequent participant in these recordings. So welcome, Matt. Thanks for doing this with us.
Thanks very much for having me, Paul. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, it's exciting to have you back. I have been reflecting on the last few episodes, and we are falling into the mid-season trap of the episodes getting longer and longer and longer. I actually was just editing. By the time this gets published, it will be out there. The Kyrie Baker episode. If you go look at it, you'll. It's a long episode, so yeah, I don't know that this edition in the beginning is much adder, but I just want to say that this is fun, and we need to make it'll be fun, right, guys?
It's a bad idea to get grid nerds talking about optimization. It just it's a recipe for long episodes.
The thing was, like, I was going through the edits, and I did cut a little bit of stuff, but not much, and it was all just good stuff that we was like, this is helpful. This is adding to the discourse, as far as I'm concerned.
There's still a demographic out there for it, right?
Yes, there is.
At least
there
four of
is.
us.
And really surprising that people actually do keep listening to this. It's really surprising to me. On Public Power Underground, we talk about the energy enthusiasm trifecta of electrification, markets, and people. On today's episode, we're discussing utility risk. Included in today's episode is an interview with Katherine Blunt, the author of California Burning. California Burning is a book about the fall of Pacific Gas and Electric and what it means for America's power grid. And of course, want to add a special thanks to our presenting sponsor, the Energy Authority. TEA folks, thanks for making this possible. Matt and I are going to take it away with Short to Ground, our TLDR segment that covers topical news stories. We're cutting the 30 seconds of theory this week, trying to learn the lesson of not making it too long. So we're cutting that this week.
And that 30 seconds is going to make all the difference.
The 30 seconds of theory actually ends up taking about 6 to 10 minutes because I keep asking questions. Gosh darn curiosity. Gets you every time. You ready, Matt?
Absolutely.
This is Short to Ground, a segment where we blow a fuse covering the news. I'm Paul Dockery.
And I'm Matt Schroettnig.
And we're shorting
to ground. On April 25th, the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, announced a suite of standards to cut greenhouse gas emissions, as well as toxic air pollution, water pollution, and land contamination from fossil fuel plants. And the Department of Energy announced up to $331 million for new transmission lines built by union labor, and a final rule to make federal permitting of new transmission lines more efficient.
Ooh, love efficient transmission permitting processes. Yes, please. The Bureau of Land Management updated its regulations on broadband authorization, cost recovery, and vegetation management for fire risk management in a final rule on March 28th. According to BLM's press release, the rule clarifies requirements for vegetation management that will enhance public safety while helping protect investments in infrastructure and resources on public lands. The rule also makes it easier for broadband service providers to put communication infrastructure on public land to help ensure communities across America are connected. A policy I'm very enthusiastic about. You will note, and I don't know if you all listen regularly, this may be your first, but if you do, normally when I do Short to Ground, my audio starts getting really slow. It's because I'm sharing my screen and I don't have the internet bandwidth to cover both of it. This week I'm not doing that because I learned that lesson. And hopefully in the future, I'll have some broadband. Take it away, Matt.
NewsData's Dan Ketchpole covered a letter from 26 entities from across the West to the Southwest Power Pool expressing interest in continuing the development of Markets Plus in the latest edition of Clearing Up. You can find a link to the reporting in the show notes. Markets Plus is a day-ahead market offering being developed by the Pacific Northwest, in the Pacific Northwest by SPP.
Portland General Electric is seeking approval for a new 7.4-mile, 115 kV transmission line in South Portland to support growing industrial loads and a new water treatment plant. Coverage by Greg Mason in Clearing Up.
Spot market power in the Northwest for delivery Friday, April 26 was $25 per megawatt hour, with natural gas at $1.07 per MMBTU, translating to a spark spread of $17.51 and a heat rate of 23,400. Spot power in the Southwest was at negative 50 cents a megawatt hour, Southern California at $4, and Northern California at $13.63, New England at $23.85, and the Mid-Atlantic at $22.18. Finally, the Midwest was at $15.28.
Wholesale spot prices for NEM, the National Electricity Market for some of Australia, on April 26th average $111.91 in New South Wales, $105.43 for Queensland, $145.17 for South Australia, $141.10 for Victoria, and Tasmania settled at $91.60. All units are in Australian dollars per megawatt hour. And we haven't made a $1 joke or a Bluey joke, I think, about the fact the pricing in Australia. I assume the $1 that are referenced in Bluey is not really an Australian thing. It's a writer of the show's thing. Is that right, Farhad?
Mm-hmm.
You ever heard of $1? Okay,
that's right. I've watched a few episodes of Bluey over over my time, but yeah, that's an awesome thing. It's not so much down here.
Okay, got it.
Don't get me started on Bluey. Big fan. I know nothing about the conversion rate or the exchange rate, rather. But are those high, Farhad? I was just talking about $15 and $22 pricing a second ago. But that's US.
Yeah. I mean, our markets generally tend to have higher prices. There's a whole host of reasons for that, but yeah. That conversion always kind of does look high when you do that.
Sorry for the diversion. Thank you. Back to the North American energy market. Prices rose 9 cents from $1.50 per million British thermal units, or MMBTU, Wednesday, April 17th, to $1.59 MMBTU, Wednesday, April 14th. The price of the 12-month strip, averaging May 2024 through April 2025 futures contracts, climbed 3.3 cents to $2.80 MMBTU.
According to Baker Hughes, for the week ending Tuesday, April 16th, the natural gas rig count decreased by 3 rigs from a week ago to 106 rigs. The total rig count, which includes 2 miscellaneous rigs, now stands at 619 rigs, 134 fewer rigs than last year at this time.
Net injections of natural gas into storage totaled 92 BCF for the week ending April 19th, compared with the 5-year 2019 through 2023 average net injections of 59 BCF and last year's net injections of 77 BCF during the same week. Working natural gas stocks totaled 2,425 BCF, which is 655 BCF, or 37% more than the 5-year average, and 439 BCF, or 22% more than last time this year.
That's it for our. Yeah, you got it. I got it on the first time. I understood what you were trying to say. That's it for our TLDR segment. Thanks to Public Power Underground's production partners at NewsData for letting us use their leads. If you want to know more, you can find complete stories in California energy markets and Clearing Up. Other Matt, to close out the segment?
Ready.
That's short to ground. Okay. Any other news that we should have caught in short to ground, or anything else you want to take away, Farhad?
Just some news down here. It probably pales in terms of magnitude relative to investment in other larger markets, but we're kicking off our large-scale capacity investment scheme in Australia, which is a 30 gigawatt scheme to a centrally run tender process for renewables and storage. And so this is really important for us because our market was traditionally an energy-only market, which really where investment decisions and contracting decisions were all pushed out to private market participants. This is a big shift away from that. It's been building for the last year or so, and so we're just kicking off the large scale auctions now. So it's a pretty big thing down here, but also a good test case for investment.
So it's like a national procurement, like what we would call an RFP for resources to bid in.
That's
Is that
right.
kind of what it is?
That's
Okay.
right. And one of the unique things about this is the contract. I mean, this is linked to, I think, some of the discussions we'll be having later in the year on resource adequacy and contract design and those sorts of things. But there's some really interesting aspects of this scheme that have a broader significance too. So stay tuned to this one. I think just keep it on the watch list.
Is there a corresponding must offer obligation on the part of the utilities, or is this purely voluntary at this point?
No, this is, so basically it doesn't look anything like a traditional capacity auction. It's basically the central government and then delegated to the states saying, hey, we're going to give you like a risk hedging contract, which is like they call it like a cap and a floor, right? So they cap your revenues and then they floor your revenues and they say, go tell me what you need. And so resources bid into that, and there's a process to kind of then decide of the X how many projects they get. They're going to select a certain subsection of that of the folks that bid, and then give them some longer term contracts so they can essentially go and make the investment. And there's obviously a whole host more to it, but that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Yeah, the way I think about this is a good example of hybrid markets. So this is the idea that perhaps in the future you would keep short-run markets as competition in the market, but you would have this kind of centralized procurement as competition for the market. So we'll definitely talk about this later, about the pros and cons of these different approaches. But I Farhad, please jump in if you see it differently. But I think this is an example of that competition for the market, where you run the risk of the central procurer making a bad estimate as to what types of resources and how much of those resources it should procure, but you get some other benefits by going down that more centralized route, including this investor certainty via these kinds of contracts that the government is offering.
An area, when we get into this more in a future episode, an area I'm really interested in is making the instruments we're using for that long-term contracting and make sure the incentives of those instruments match the necessary behavior within the spot market and bidding behavior in the spot market. I think I've seen some interesting research around the necessary, like how to structure instruments for long-term markets that make them more efficient in short-term markets, but that's where I want to go. So I'm just seeding the thoughts for later of
some good foreshadowing.
Foreshadowing, yes. Good curiosity.
Really,
anything else?
Sorry, Paul.
Go ahead, Matt.
I was just going to say I'd be really curious to know how different, and we don't have to get into it now, like you said, seeding for future conversations, but how different what Conleigh just described is from at least what PJM was trying to be. Without unpacking that further in the interest of time.
Future work, future episode. Good seeding, Matt. That's good. Good. Matt, anything you wanted to follow up on?
I'm just excited to learn more. Like you said, anything that makes permitting more efficient is probably a step in the right direction. So I think at Boardman and Hemingway, a project here in the West that got started over 18 years ago, and we still don't necessarily know when we'll see energization. So yeah, that's a good thing. Hopefully it'll make some progress there.
Yep. Well, for me, I mean, Farhad, as far as I was concerned, buried some leads here. We didn't even include in Short to Ground his new paper that got published with Jacob Mays on Tuesday. This is obviously an area of interest and enthusiasm for me personally. Some of my favorite people releasing a paper together. The title of the paper is Hedging and Tail Risk in Electricity Markets. We could talk about it now. We could talk about it later. What do you want to say about it, Farhad?
No, this was a really interesting project to work on. It's kind of relevant to the former discussion we're just having. I mean, maybe we should do that episode right after this one. But yeah, it was really interesting and some really surprising results. I'll leave it at that and sort of tease folks to go and click and have a quick look.
Okay, I'll tease it a little bit more because one of the reasons I first connected with Professor Mays was the work he did with Jesse Jenkins on the changing dynamics and market exposure under deeply decarbonized markets. And this is like a really important follow-up to that paper. So that's more of a tease. It was great work by Professor Mays and Professor Jenkins, and now it's great work by Farhad and Jacob. People now I use their first names because I feel like we're friends, so I can use them. And there was a third author. Can you remind me who the third author of this paper was?
Yeah, that's Dr. Ramat Pudane over at Oxford Institute for Energy Studies.
Yes, brilliant people, great work.
This is timely for the Northwest. A lot of utilities in the area were historically able to hedge everything physically, and illiquidity, particularly in futures contracts, has made that pretty much impossible. And so folks are looking at, financial instruments and other alternatives available to them. And it's opening people's eyes because it's not always as easy as it might seem. So I have not read it in its entirety. I read enough to get intimidated, and I look forward to digging in more.
You know what I did? This is a personal pitch. I'm pitching you all, and we'll see if it gets cut. So I found an app that would read the PDF to me. And I have a very long commute, and I listen to it on the way home. And this is my pitch. What if one of these journals that publishes these papers wanted to have somebody that knew the industry record these papers and read them so that they were available in audio format? I know a person who has wonderful recording equipment who would be enthusiastic about participating in this gig. So if you know somebody who runs one of these publications that really, or have a paper that you feel like would be promoted so that people could easily access it through their apps, audio apps, just saying, I'm here, I'm willing. I thought it was a great market opportunity. Just so you know.
I love that idea, but didn't you just say that there's an app that'll do that for you?
But it was terrible. And you know what? It didn't know how to pronounce like dollar per megawatt hour. It didn't know what like level, there were a bunch of terms in there. I was like, that's not what that is, but I kind of know what it is. I wouldn't mess up MISO. I would know how to say MISO, and I would know how to say megawatts, and I would convert everything to average megawatts because average megawatts are the best unit for energy, not megawatt hours. That's it.
And you would say IRA, right? Not it's not the IRA. That's one mistake I've made. I've made, and people have just told me like,
and IRA and Uncle Bill.
You could really confuse someone pretty quickly.
Yep. Okay, well, we're going to take a quick break for a word from our presenting sponsor, and then you'll hear the interview with Katherine Blunt. Public Power Underground is sponsored by the Energy Authority. The energy transition is upon us, and if there's one company who has public power's back, it's the Energy Authority. TEA isn't just any sponsor of the show, they're the backbone of what we stand for, keeping the power in the hands of the people. With offices in Bellevue, Washington, and Jacksonville, Florida, TEA has coast-to-coast expertise in energy trading, RTO management, portfolio management, advanced analytics, renewable energy, and much more. As the energy industry evolves, so does TEA, staying on the cutting edge of technology to help their 75-plus public power clients maximize the value of their assets. When you partner with TEA, you're not just keeping up, you're leading the charge. Learn more at teainc.org. That's teainc.org for more. This week, Crystal Ball and I interviewed Katherine Blunt. Katherine covers renewable energy and utilities for the Wall Street Journal. Her team's reporting on Pacific Gas and Electric has been honored with a Bartlett and Steele Award for Business Investigative Journalism, the Thomas L. Stokes Award for Energy and Environmental Reporting, a Gerald Loeb Award, the highest honor in business journalism, and was named a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Katherine is the author of the book California Burning, The Fall of Pacific Gas and Electric, and What It Means for America's Power Grid. Joining me for the interview was Crystal Ball. Crystal is a regular contributor. You're probably all very familiar with her. She is also the executive director of the Pacific Northwest Utilities Conference Committee, PNUC.
Hi, Katherine. Welcome to Public Power Underground.
Thank you for having me.
Do you have any idea what you're getting into?
I Maybe I don't. I guess we'll have to see.
Okay, well, whatever you're getting into, hopefully we can make it fun. On Public Power Underground, we seek out diverse perspectives on the energy industry or the energy transition to provide some insight into their areas of enthusiasm that may get lost in abstraction when considered by people like policymakers and researchers. So you're a business reporter for the Wall Street Journal. You cover a lot of complex energy topics and energy issues. What draws your attention in the energy sector?
Well, so I started covering utilities and the power sector in 2018, and I knew that it was already obviously a very important area of coverage, and only would become more so, right? As we see all kinds of different things, making it so that people are thinking differently about the grid, whether that's because of climate-related stress, whether that's because they're using more electricity for various reasons, adopting EVs, home electrification. And the fact that really all eyes are on the utility companies right now in being able to prepare for an electrified future, harden the grid, address new stressors, and it's been quite the ride.
So do you feel like you did a good job of, foreshadowing what your career might be when you joined it and you started on this sector in 2018? Do you feel like your priors had gotten validated by your research from then?
So my first day on the job was November 5th, 2018, which was 3 days before the Camp Fire that destroyed Paradise and set off very significant chain of events for PG&E. So a lot of my work for the first year plus at the Journal focused on PG&E almost exclusively, and that was really the lens through which I came to understand many aspects of the industry. And as I remember, at that time, talking to people about PG&E and about California, people in the utility space, and I mean, the refrain was, "This is a California problem. This isn't a problem for other utilities." And we can unpack as to why they might have thought that, but I don't think that. I mean, that's not holding true anymore. And then we're not just wildfire either. I mean, climate-related stress and on an already aging system is problematic everywhere.
Katherine, what an interesting time to begin a journey. As you said, when you started this job, so much was happening. Your book, California Burning, is very much a cautionary tale for electric utility enthusiasts like us. But how do you view your role as a reporter?
I said earlier, I think that people are thinking about the grid in ways that they haven't had to before, but that's not to say they necessarily understand it better. So in terms of writing for the layperson who's not in the industry, I mean, doing anything to help them sort of understand the complexity of these systems, I find that I'm very passionate about that because I think it is important. I mean, it's the regulatory process isn't exactly welcoming, but it is participatory, right? And I think that the more people can sort of understand that or talk intelligently with people who are involved, I think that's net benefit for everybody. But also, I mean, at the same time, I'm also writing for people who do understand these systems, and hopefully what is amazing to me is sometimes hearing from people within the industry who have a very narrow remit, right? So they're looking at something fairly narrowly. So a story that kind of gets above what they're looking at on the day-to-day and brings together a lot of different factors or helps to elucidate a trend is valuable too. So I kind of see my role as trying to play to both of those sides.
Yeah, I appreciate that too. I think even like having some journalistic perspective that brings history into the issues that we're seeing today is really valuable, because it does, I get into my own rabbit holes thinking about specific topics. And when journalists like what your work frequently does, gets me to think about it in a grand scheme of things, is really helpful. So thank you. I also love
great to hear
your comment that the regulatory process is not welcoming, but is participatory. I think that's really insightful. There are entities, believe it or not, that want it to be both welcoming and participatory. Our friends at co-ops are the best at this. And I think we could all learn a lot from them. They make it very engaging. The best of them make it very engaging for their members. But yeah, I wanted to underline that comment and save it for later. I think that's really helpful.
Sure.
Katherine, I noticed in the acknowledgments in your book, you admitted that this was no simple story to tell, but that you were very surprised at the wide appeal that this complex story would have. So, I just noted that, and feel like, I'm very grateful for you putting that book together, that people are interested in what you wrote, and it's a really great history for those of us who work in the industry.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And the project, I mean, it was such an undertaking, but it really has been gratifying. So PG&E itself made it required reading for senior leaders, which is really great. I mean, if it even affects one person's decision making in a positive way, then that's a real success. But it's I mean, we're sitting here and we're talking about this more than a year and a half after, roughly a year and a half after it came out, right? I mean, we are seeing every day more and more clearly that this does the set of dynamics that PG&E has faced. We're seeing that elsewhere, right? And there's been continued interest from other utilities, to this day, as they're sort of grappling with some of these issues, and also just people who are curious about this story, especially after, I think, reading about some of the challenges that maybe their utility companies are facing.
I'm a youngest sibling. I'm the youngest of four, and one of, I think, the values I've learned from that is learning from the mistakes of my older siblings, and I think that's one of the lessons we can do. And I think one of the takeaways I've gotten out of this book is prioritizing reliability. I think we're ready to talk about reliability and what that means and how the book reflects that. You ready, Crystal?
Always ready to talk about reliability.
Yes.
Yes. Good segue, Paul. Katherine, you have raised serious concerns about power system reliability, and you point out in California Burning that PG&E focused its spending on the transition to cleaner resources, which left less for distribution and transmission system maintenance, creating substantial risk. You also noted California lawmakers and regulators treated the utilities as a tool in the quest to preempt the long-term effects of climate change. So in doing so, both PG&E and the policymakers failed to recognize the changing climate had made PG&E power lines an immediate threat to public safety. Unfortunately, it took an unprecedented disaster to reveal the extent of the risk. How do you think industry could do a better job telling a more complete story about the impacts of incentive structures and public policies on power system reliability?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. And I'll say off the top, like, to point out that dynamic is not a criticism of the energy transition, right? It's like climate change is real. The energy transition must continue. It's like it is, and California was a leader on this front. And the fact that there was, these ambitious mandates early on is part of the reason why, we ended up, or were able to create the economies of scale necessary to drive down the cost of wind and solar, right? That's very good. Those are all good things.
Yep.
And utility companies can and should be, have really active roles in helping to meet, California utilities meeting California targets, other utilities meeting other state targets. I mean, it has to be done often through the utilities, right? The ones that are going out to procure the power. That's all fine. But the question is, does the company have like commensurate resources to address operational risk? It's a question that every utility should be asking. I pointed out, like, after sort of reviewing some of the issues in Hawaii after the fire in Lahaina, that utility has been focused on procuring more clean power. That's great. They're very reliant on very expensive fossil fuels to run their power plants. And so, to continue that transition is net positive for everybody, right? But the company really wasn't focused on immediate operational risk, especially as it related to wildfire, which is not something that they've historically had to encounter. They tried to sort of do a proactive review of this stuff after seeing what PG&E was facing in California, and just like it was a good effort, but it was just not comprehensive, and they didn't really move fast, in part because of just the way the regulatory process works there and elsewhere. And so I just think it's like, Yeah, I mean, utilities very much have a role to play in the transition. They're also seeing new risks emerge that need to be dealt with in operationally, and often like through like, you know, the maintenance budget, basically stuff that you're not going to rate base. So it's just a question, where are your resources? Do you have enough to do both things at once? You know, tongue in cheek, walk and chew gum at the same time, right? So yeah.
I want to understand it or think of it in terms of like the increases of work we're asking utilities to do. And we're asking them to do, there's two things, right? The externalities that utilities are facing are increasing. The wildfire risk, I swear I've been talking all day. The wildfire risk is increasing. Cyber security risk is increasing.
Mm-hmm.
We're subject to attacks on critical infrastructure, and we're trying to deploy to meet electrification goals and meet the clean energy transition and retire existing resources. So it seems like we are expanding what we ask of a utility. And a part of the lesson out of your book is making sure that you don't abandon some of the core functions of utility service when it comes to maintaining and operating a system when you're expanding that. Am I hearing right the what you would want us to communicate more effectively?
I think so. I mean, yes, I think that's right. And if we're talking about sort of what was quote unquote new for PG&E, I guess there was a couple of dynamics that influenced it. One was the focus on procuring a lot of clean power. Like that was of interest to like working within the utility company as well as within the California Public Utilities Commission. Like that was kind of the sexier place to be. But you know, not to jump too far back, but you know, everyone probably listening to this knows that PG&E faced bankruptcy twice now. The first time was after the California energy crisis. And so part of the focus too, coming out of that, was like, how do we regain the goodwill of shareholders? It's not really like a new dynamic, but it was like they were trying to sort of reinvent themselves after a crisis. And that was another thing that ended up diverting the focus off just day-to-day O&M that ended up being really critical over the long term. But yeah, right now, I mean, multiply that by 10 in terms of what utilities have to sort of think about and try to address either proactively or reactively. And yeah, I mean, there's a million things that could sort of take your eye off the ball, I guess. Or like you're addressing some, but not other parts. It's all very important, clearly, right? So it's certainly a tough balancing act.
And you put your finger on the pulse when it comes to investment and making sure that there's access to capital so that we can continue to deploy new resources, new infrastructure, which is the segue to our next question, I think, Crystal, about what wildfires are doing to the investment community.
Yeah, we're going to switch a little bit from your book to some of your reporting for the Wall Street Journal. And I recently picked up that you wrote an April 8th Wall Street Journal article on the increased liability costs faced by utilities in the West due to climate change and drought. And your article references Warren Buffett's annual letter, where he wrote to shareholders that he might rethink utility investments in states at high risk of wildfire. I'm here in Oregon and thinking about PacifiCorp, which is headquartered here in Portland. So at a period where the electric sector needs significant transmission investment to meet electrification and decarbonization goals, what insight can you share from your reporting on ways to enable public-private partnerships to effectively do it?
Public-private partnerships. I don't know if I'm quite prepared to answer that question, but it's, I mean, I think that the question is like right now, I think that, yes, we're talking about wildfire risk, especially in the West. It's not just the West, right? I mean, Minnesota was on fire a couple of years ago. We've seen horrible stuff in Canada. I think one of the reasons earlier I had said that folks in the industry not too long ago were fairly confident that this was largely a California problem, in part because California has a somewhat unique liability construct in which power companies are liable for any and all damages resulting from fires ignited by their power lines, regardless of negligence. In the cases we're talking about with PG&E, I mean, there was negligence, so I don't know if it's it's a little bit of a moot point, but now you're sort of seeing more aggressive plaintiffs' attorneys bring charges against other utilities whose power lines have started fires, arguing negligence on all kinds of different all kinds of different levels, right? It's becoming becoming more of a playbook for this. And it's interesting. I mean, in some cases it's like negligent for failing to proactively turn off the power. That wasn't even really a thing prior to 2019. I mean, it like occasionally by some of the Southern California utilities, but I mean, it's just sort of been like anathema to the way the industry works for so long, but now it's becoming commonplace to have protocols for that in place, but some utilities don't, right? So it's like, how quickly can you move on a like really robust wildfire mitigation plan that does include those protocols is probably necessary now. It's surprising to me right now how many utilities in the West actually don't have firm protocols in place to do that. Right. I think that is a liability issue. So the question of public-private partnerships, not to, get really far afield of the question. I mean, I think that there's a lot of ways that you can like leverage all kinds of stuff, whether that be, I don't know. I mean, whether that be something like local government support or technology or something. And there are solutions out there. And I think the question is like, how quickly can you move, and like, how can you be assured that you're like proactively covering all your bases rather than having to reactively, like a Hawaiian Electric being like, oh, well, I guess we need a PSPS system in place, which we didn't have before, right? So hopefully answered the question. I'm not sure if I did.
You can answer whatever question you want us to ask, and then we'll just pretend that that's what we asked. That's fine. This is a low bar. Just happy to have you. I like the making sure we're interpreting like the changing dynamics within the electric utility and the electric sector around how this risk has moved beyond just California. I mean, Colorado, I think, just announced they're going to have a public safety power shutoff protocol at their utilities. It's moving, and it'll continue to grow that dynamic, and that does, I think it does have an impact on capital that's willing to invest in that type of resource. I think your reporting did a good job of articulating that and laying out the perspective of one major investor in utilities.
Yeah, you kind of said the quiet part out loud. I think like a lot of investors have been wondering about this for a while.
Yeah,
so.
He said it in the shareholder letter.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, it does make me think about the wildfire mitigation plans that regulators have required utilities to have. And here in the Northwest, we have investor-owned utilities and consumer-owned utilities. And so I see utilities, at least here in the Pacific Northwest, collaborating on those wildfire mitigation plans. So, that's something that we didn't do before this risk was really unveiled. And I think utilities are taking it seriously, and there have been some significant changes in the way utilities operate their systems because of the events and the information that has been shared about these events and how they occurred.
Yeah, I think that's right, and it's also been interesting. I don't know exactly when it formed, but EEI has a wildfire task force now and is trying to educate all utilities about not just utilities, but regulatory bodies as well, and asking the kind of the right questions about how the industry should address this risk writ large. I mean, before we were talking about it as a California problem. Right now, we're kind of talking about it as a problem in the West. It probably won't be long before we're talking really talking about it in the national context.
Yeah, so we've talked about increased liability and maybe how that would temper investor sentiment about the sector. Next, we're going to pivot to some recent reporting you've done around why there's growth in our segment, right? There's a lot of new loads. You've covered some of that. So, Krista, I'll hand it back to you to talk about load growth.
Yes, thank you. This is what I'm really excited to ask Katherine about, given what I do at PNUC. Katherine, I read an article you co-authored on March 24th covering the big Houston Energy Conference. Your article is titled, "Big Tech's Latest Obsession is Finding Enough Energy." And the lead reads, quote, "The AI boom is fueling an insatiable appetite for electricity, which is creating risks to the grid and the transition to clean energy resources." In that article, the growth in data center load is referred to as exponential, staggering, and incredible. When PNUC released its Northwest Regional Forecast last year in 2023, we reported a significant increase in demand for electricity. And right now we are working on our 2024 update, and we are showing a continued projection of increase in demand over the next 10 years by more than 7,000 megawatts. That is roughly a 30% increase in demand in our region. And so that's why I was so excited to ask you about this. You wrote about it. What are your thoughts, and where are we in the hype cycle?
Yeah. I think it was fascinating. So the big Houston conference is Sarah Week, and that was probably, I don't know, it might have been my 6th conference. And usually like there's some sort of predictable theme, kind of depending on like where oil prices are or gas or like or whatever. But in this case, I think one thing that was a genuine surprise to me and other people there was the extent to which this discussion about how the development of generative AI is going to affect power demand. I mean, for a long time, there's been the prediction that there's going to be reasonably substantial load growth tied to electrification and the switch to EVs. But then you layer on this sort of relatively new dynamic that seems to, I mean, people who are paying close attention to the AI space are probably not surprised by this, but for a lot of people who weren't, it's just like, whoa, like where did this come from, you know? And it really does almost feel like an overnight shift, which it like, especially in utility terms,
Yes.
right? So I think that there's like a lot of questions that like very much remain unsolved that we need to answer before we can figure out like actually how much power is needed. I mean, certainly a lot is needed right now. You're seeing Microsoft and Google and others signing PPAs like left and right? And like there's, I think we heard some crazy stat at the conference that like the world adds a data center every 3 days or something like that globally. But like chip efficiency is the actual energy efficiency of the process going to be meaningfully changed to the point where it affects projections, right? Or like in terms of where we are in the hype cycle, we're very early on in the generative AI hype cycle. So like what ultimately happens with that? I mean, these are big questions, but if everything sort of continues apace or accelerates, it's like, wow, like we do need a lot of power. And for, I think especially, you know, tech companies, utility companies that have really ambitious clean energy targets, like a lot of stuff needs to be added in the immediate term. What decisions are you going to make as to like what generation source that's going to be? There were some executives at that conference saying like, we can't do it without new gas. Then of course, you know, you quickly get an argument on the other side that's like, no, like we can absolutely do it without new gas. And it's just sort of like, it's really hard to like really vet the accuracy of those statements right now. And it certainly depends on regional dynamics, like all kinds of different stuff. And like, it's already getting competitive for renewables in terms of like the best land, right? And that's only going to be more so. And it'll be interesting to see the way tech companies throw their weight around on this front. And there's been some interesting like behind the meter nuclear deals. Like it's a lot of complex stuff, and it's like it's just gonna get more interesting and more questions before we have answers.
So interesting, and I really appreciated the words you used on that insatiable appetite for electricity. It is concerning, especially when you layer it on, plans to decarbonize, and what we are looking at here in the Northwest. Oregon, I saw in a recent report, Oregon is the nation's 5th largest data center market.
Yeah.
So, we have our pocket here in the Northwest, and last year we issued our PNOC report, and it was the biggest change in growth that we had seen since the 1980s. So it's something that we are thinking about in this region. Utilities are planning for this future. One of the things that we also report in the Northwest Regional Forecast is utilities plan future resources. And we are seeing a lot of plans or a lot identified in these plans. But there are a lot of challenges. And we worry about resource adequacy if we cannot connect these new resources to the grid. And like I said, there's a lot of challenges in doing that. We're trying to address as utilities, but they are beyond our control sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we used to have this concept of direct service industries up here in the Northwest that were non-firm loads that were subject to being the first ones cut off the grid. That may be something, because I think, Crystal, you referred to it as like concerning for electric utilities. It could also be exciting. Like there are ways to enable investment in the resources we know we need, the infrastructure we know we need, the transmission we know we need in order to be able to serve load. And if we do it, if we have this sort of near-term incentive to meet some high value load, maybe that can help us solve the problem more effectively.
Yeah.
I want to pivot, or unless you have a follow-up, Crystal.
No, just one more thought on that. I see utilities collaborating more. That's exciting.
We love our collaboration here in the Northwest. That in a good process. So obviously, Crystal and I recommend your book to anyone in the electric sector. We think it's just a great introduction, actually, to the history. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. But I was wondering, just because one of the questions we have is like, what lessons do you have for policymakers, researchers, practitioners in this space? Katherine, what would you encourage our listeners to be thinking about for? Just what? Anything. You can answer this question with whatever you want to leave us with.
Well, I mean, I feel like I say this a lot, but it's unfortunate that in this industry, not just this industry, but others, but it often just like takes a disaster, right? So we have the PG&E disaster, and I mean, it's hard to say, I don't mean this like in a critical way, but what's unfortunate is I think maybe some utilities tried to draw some lessons from it immediately and be proactive in trying to address, try to understand what wildfire risk looked like for them and the steps that they could take to potentially mitigate it. But again, here we are in 2024 with utilities in the West without PSPS protocols, or similar challenges with vegetation management, or century-old transmission lines that perhaps haven't been subject to the proper amount of scrutiny, whatever it may be. And I think, so then the question is like, how, when you observe another disaster, how can you be more proactive in making sure you don't face something similar? Because now we're seeing this repeat, right? We've seen Hawaii, Oregon, Colorado, and Texas. But then the question becomes, which is an even harder one, is like, how do you be proactive about other risks that may emerge that haven't maybe yet resulted in a disaster? And I was just talking to some folks at PG&E the other day, and they asked sort of a similar question. I said, well, it's really great that all the focus is on wildfire risk right now, but what's the next risk, right? Because first it was gas, and then it was distribution, and then it was transmission. And they operate a nuclear plant and a bunch of hydro. So I just throwing that out there, right? So what's
the next risk? You have it? Do you know it?
Next risk.
Do you know it?
I don't know the next risk. I'm Captain Hindsight. I come in after the problem and help people understand. So, but anyway.
Well, I appreciate that. And we'll keep looking for the next risk, and somebody will find it first. And then we'll learn from the people who do it
or somebody won't find it first, and that'll be it.
Yep. There we go.
Let's hope we learn from each other as we identify what the potential next risks could be.
Yes, let's hope we're all paying attention. One of the values of like paying attention, the journalism is a way to make sure you're paying attention, and the great work of books and histories is about, if you're paying attention, there may be something learned there. So we definitely appreciate your work you're doing.
Thank you.
So in the season of Public Hour Underground, we're doing energy system analogies in a World Cup style. We're playing in a tournament. In your book, you have an analogy about the energy system like roads. I wondered if you wanted to enter that analogy into our ESSA World Cup as a way of understanding the electric sector.
Sure. I mean, I think anyone coming, especially people who are just, I mean, not steeped in this stuff, you say distribution and transmission, they're like, what? Like, what's the, and it's easy, right? It's easy. Like, if you think about the grid as a network of roads, transmission lines are the highways that, you know, carry a bunch of traffic. And then, you know, the distribution lines are like roads and streets. And I guess you could consider substations to be off ramps, right? So I think it's easy enough for people to understand. And then it's like, oh, okay, like these words are approachable now. So yeah, I'm happy to enter that.
Okay, what's going to be in there? You're also going to rank our analogies, right? I gave you a form, a link to a Google form, or I can afterwards, because I have an analogy. Crystal has an analogy. We'd appreciate if you could rank us, because that's how we're going to figure out who gets to compete in a tournament.
Excellent.
Great. So we're gonna record a follow-up after this. We're gonna go deep into history and Taylor Swift. But before we do that, I just wanted to, this will be the end for the regular episode, and I just wanted to say thank you. Hopefully you feel seen, heard, valued, and appreciated.
Sure do. Thank you very much for having me.
Good. Thank you. Crystal, always seen, heard, valued, and appreciated. I appreciate you doing this with me.
Oh, I appreciate you for inviting me to do this with you.
Great. Now back to Conleigh, Farhad, Almaz for more energy enthusiasm. Welcome back. Now we're going to debrief from the discussion. Any reflections from the interview with Katherine? Matt, I'll start with you.
Thank you, Paul. Two things really jumped out at me. Now, first, I have to call out that the book, the depth and the narrative of Katherine's reporting, rather the narrative and depth of Katherine's reporting, in the book California Burning that Paul is so capably holding up to the screen for those of you on the podcast, which I had to call out because if anybody hasn't read it, if anybody who's listening and hasn't read it, they're really missing out. My copy is right there. Paul has his in his hand. Mine is on a shelf behind me. I'm pointing to it. Makes for great radio, this, doesn't it?
It does.
But if anyone is listening and would like to borrow it, just reach out and let me know. I'd be happy to let you borrow it, so long as you promise to give it back.
No, you have to buy the book. We're all professionals in an industry. We can support journalism and buy the book. Go out and buy the book, support Katherine. That's the goal. You make a great point. You can borrow it today so long as you promise to buy it tomorrow. That's a better way to say it, Matt.
Now, second, and more to the point, I love the way that she recognized the fact that today people are viewing the grid differently than they have historically. I used to work with somebody who Paul actually knows, who would joke that his grandparents and parents would think that electricity came from the light switch. Now you contrast that with today and the conversations we have where more people are choosing to make themselves accountable by, for example, installing rooftop solar, batteries and the like, or by getting involved local and state levels to make their voices heard with respect to resource mix or carbon-free generation, stuff like that. Finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't call out Katherine's comment that while the regulatory process isn't welcoming, it is participatory, because I thought that was brilliant. And that was probably my favorite line.
That was a great line. That was a great line. Conleigh, any other takeaways, any reflections?
I think the comment that it's difficult to be proactive about risks that haven't yet resulted in a disaster was a really great observation. And, I think this really underscores how much we need to think about modeling counterfactuals moving forward. Of course, there are some events that maybe truly are black swan events that we really wouldn't have prepared for, but I think a lot of these in retrospect, it seems, well, we probably could have anticipated this. We probably could have anticipated Winter Storm Uri in Texas and having a lack of weatherization of the natural gas infrastructure. Not to pick on Texas too much, but when, in response to that disaster, we have this new reserve product in Texas that the independent market monitor thinks cost about 12 billion in excess wholesale market costs over the course of last year. So I think there's a lot of cases right now where we really are not doing enough of that counterfactual modeling. And probably if we did more of that, we would also be making some different decisions about wildfire risk management as well.
But at least they avoided those weatherization costs, right?
Fortunately, they did do some of them, but yes, perhaps not that economically efficient level.
I think it's a really Conleigh, I think you're hitting on a really important point here, because this issue of sort of managing, what the outcomes are really extreme. But what it and especially like reading through the book, one of the really interesting things was she was able to kind of bring it to really basic maintenance items, like the condition of a pole or a wire, and the condition of a transformer in a particular area. And it's kind of, again, it seems really complicated, but it's also really like nuts and bolts and good practice risk management. There was a recent event in Australia where they had essentially a extreme weather event, and it tripped a line, and then it resulted in essentially a system security event, which shook off, is the technical term, a lot of load, almost I think a gigawatt of load in one of the regions. Now it seems again that this one was a very technical event. There was circuit breakers involved, multiple trips of large units. But one of the interesting things about this is AEMO, as a power system operator, does a risk review every year. And this was actually, when you actually look at the language of one of the largest risks that they had identified, this was actually a very similar element of this was right in there. So it also indicates that good practice risk management, this is kind of what we need to get our regulatory framework to do, is to have that balance between obviously large scale investment, which we all need for new transmission, all this sort of good stuff, but we also need the nuts and bolts, the everyday work being done, particularly because it's so much to do with public safety. This is the classic challenge of utility regulation, but we really need to make sure that risk awareness is there, and there are folks incentivized to do it.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. That there are some of these things that are at the edge of our design envelope, and we often fixate on those when we're thinking about risk management. But there's a lot of things that are really important that are firmly within our normal design envelope that are maybe being neglected because of a failure of regulatory oversight or some other thing that's not getting translated well in practice.
I think you just described utilities as a whole, irrespective of what utility we're talking about, right? Well, I mean, Paul's making a face. The number of issues we hear about across the country with regard to water supply, right? Obviously we're all talking about electricity and electricity infrastructure, but gas infrastructure, the example that Conleigh gave earlier with respect to Texas, there's a lot of things that we take for granted, where that level of oversight and the nuts and bolts and the little things are what end up causing those big problems down the line.
Yeah, and we couldn't get into some of the examples from her book. That I wanted to go really deep on very specific things, and Crystal, of course, in her brilliance was like, Paul, don't go so deep on that one thing. But there was this example in the book about how it was one of these utility practices, like a maintenance inspection program, that kind of got fallen away out of like fumbled through handoffs of people's retirement about why they were doing an inspection. And it was because of a material that was known to have some weakness, and they had implemented an inspection program to have an early warning. But then as time came and management and people transitioned out, that fell away and the importance of it was lost. And then they stopped doing the inspections, and that led on to this thing where, it wasn't inspected and it fell and caused a fire. And that for me was an example that it really resonated with me, because it's something I could see happen so easily in a utility, especially amongst churn of people. in institutions, even in engineering institutions that that don't have maybe the discipline of records that are necessary, and the discipline of like the desire for disruption that comes externally. One of the things we see in our industry is a desire to disrupt our industry because people perceive us as inefficient and like cumbersome. And so there's this desire to disrupt, and she talks about in the book this business transformation effort at Pacific Gas and Electric, and some of that disruption actually ends up undermining what are kind of the bureaucracy is meant to build in, the engineering reasons for doing certain practices, and that for me like really resonated. And her takeaway that like the importance of paying attention, because a black swan event, like there are things that aren't black swans that are just, to your point, Conleigh, just like these are things, these are risks, these are like the meat of the risk, but we aren't paying attention, even though they are predictable. And you really got to pay attention and not think you're smarter than everybody when you come in and do this stuff. I thought it was great.
Yeah, and it's definitely a hard question because you get into this problem where it can be very difficult to align incentives. So if we're going back to the Texas example of winterizing equipment, okay, so this is a risk that anyone could have foreseen, and that, okay, the weather does this maybe once every 10 years now. But if you're a merchant investor, and you're just going to have some lost opportunity costs if you're not available to produce when the system is really strained and prices get really high, okay, so you have some lost opportunity costs, but that's a bit different than having some kind of financial penalty if you're not available. So, if you're not in any kind of long-term contract, maybe the economic incentive isn't really there, given how you're managing your own risk. And so weatherizing your equipment might be more akin to asking an 18-year-old to take out health insurance. The Wisconsin plants, they're more like a 60-year-old taking out health insurance. They said, great, I think that this will make a lot of sense for me to do. But so when you have that misalignment of incentives, you have to have some kind of good regulation to make sure that, we're operating in a space that collectively we're all comfortable with. But it's definitely can be difficult.
I just wonder whether, like, one question that I have for everyone else, really, because there's kind of a good dichotomy in the US between investor-owned utilities, but there's also a very strong public power sector, really. And as a sort of the economist, the sort of probably the classical economist perspective on these things is ultimately it's, well, if you don't have the right incentives, a monopoly institution, you always are struggling to get the right incentives, which is kind of what this is all about, as Conleigh said. One question which I had is how does, ultimately this is also about, I hate to get like all fluffy here, but it's also about the incentives of people, right? Like it's the managers, it's the line workers, it's everyone really from the CEO down. And to me, I just wonder whether at a public agency, is there something more? Is there some sort of incentive that can work for either the better or the worse in terms of managing these risks and making sure that you're really at best practice? Again, like classical economists, maybe that a perspective as well. If you're in a nice agency, you don't actually have financial incentives, so no. But I don't know. Maybe there is something. I guess that was maybe a question to put to everyone else.
Or sometimes to add to it and build on, you have the wrong incentives. I think California Burning spoke to that a little bit with respect to some of the gas infrastructure, where teams were rewarded for finding fewer leaks, and so there's a way to do that both ways, right? A good way and a bad way. But I think it's a great question.
Obviously, I'm a public power merch because I am an enthusiast for public power, and I do like one of my perspectives on this is the grounding in community associated with public ownership of infrastructure, and understanding like the the boundaries of your community and the boundaries of your service can be an incentive that's not a financial incentive, because you don't like there it isn't the financial incentive, but it's the community incentive, like taking service that you provide, and wanting reliable service for your neighbors, and it is an incentive that exists across utilities and utility ownership. And one of the things I think, actually, frankly, a lot about is, as I think I said in this bonus episode, the Insel promise, right, of access to capital and economies of scale is in some ways, the economies of scale example is in some ways in conflict with your policy pooling requirement of a utility and that community service aspect of electric service and utility. Because I do think each community does have its own sort of policy perspective on individual utility decisions. As you get economies of scale and cross jurisdictions, you end up losing that to get economies of scale for infrastructure investment. And those to me are in conflict. And I think that's part of like aligning incentives, frankly, is in some ways aligning boundaries for communities.
Yeah, I mean, not to get too broad about this, but in some ways, when thinking about this question between, are you trying to do something more in like a planned approach versus using markets as a tool to get hopefully at least as good or a better outcome, that's certainly a trade-off, is that it's really hard to centrally plan things across a really large jurisdiction with lots and lots of different actors. Perhaps you can do a better job of that when it's a smaller system, and there's some trade-off there.
Yeah. There's more to this. I think this is a good follow-up for our conversation about common pool resources, because I do think there is a nexus in understanding the jurisdiction of that common shape of the pool, and like how you think about policies. And I don't want to talk specifically like resource type as a policy. There are like some fundamental policy choices within a utility on like line extension policy, rate making policy that are that should reflect the community, and the community can have reasonably distinct perspectives on how to do a line extension or how to price electricity for a customer at the end of a feeder. Like those are reasonable places where you can have disagreement about policy, and making sure that your decision making is close enough to the people who are affected by those choices, I think is important. A lot of people, when they think about like policy and energy system policy, they just think like coal or wind, and those are to me like extreme examples, but utilities deal with what I think are very localized policy choices quite a bit. Anything else here? We are at risk of running another really long episode.
I can't imagine how you keep doing it, honestly.
I don't know either. I'm so sorry.
Buy the book if you haven't.
Buy the book. Katherine did not update our rankings yet for the ESSO World Cup. I'll get her to fill out the form, so I don't have updated rankings this week. She did submit a new analogy from her book. It's in the book, Buy the book, around roads, like highways and streets are like the transmission and distribution systems of our electric grid. So that is a new analogy in our ESSO World Cup standings. Farhad, I think you shared on LinkedIn, somebody else was making this analogy in system security in this streets analogy. Anything you wanted to follow up on Katherine's roads and highways analogy?
Roads is right up there. It's an old classic, and yeah, we'll see how that one performs.
That's right.
Sometimes the classics are the best, right?
Sometimes there's a reason they're the classics. Matt, this is your first time on the podcast. Would you like to submit an analogy to the ESSO World Cup field?
I would love to. I'll have the record reflect this is not my first time on the podcast, but this is the first time that you've asked me.
This season. Yes, the first time this season. Matt he's pointing out he was one of the first guests on Public Power Underground, frankly.
Back in the day. That's right, I forgot.
Back in the day. Anyway, what's your analogy?
Let's not go back to that one. Nobody listened to it.
Nobody listened to that one. What's your analogy, Matt?
Yeah, so I'm thinking it might be a little fluffy to co-opt Farhad's use of the word earlier. Electricity is water, right? in this analogy. We need it to survive. It's lazy. It always flows down the path of least resistance, right? But it can also be incredibly destructive. I know there's already been a water analogy, but I promise this is different. Specifically, to me, the energy system as a whole is like a biome, or the environment around us. It's a complex system defined by the movement of water within it, and one that requires balance to function properly. Transmission here is obviously what moves water around: rivers, streams, ponds, lakes, etc. It all keeps the biome balanced, absent extreme variables or external forces. Balance is maintained, and for the animals and plants within it. And without people around, that balance stays there. In the Northwest, for example, you had beavers building dams, which slowed streams, created ponds, reducing erosion, creating wetlands, improving ecosystem diversity, improving the overall health of the system. In the Northwest, today at least, we have historically enjoyed a similar balance. From rural electrification until the present day, the existing infrastructure that we have, both on a generation and transmission perspective, have kept the lights on, improving residents' lives. And today we have enough to maintain that. The future remains a little uncertain, I think. But on a long enough timeline, any balance obviously is going to change or be in flux. External forces get involved. We had the fur trade, going back to the biome analogy. Fur trade, fewer predators, fewer beaver dams, changing the ecology, availability of water throughout the system, less reliability for the plants and animals there. Electrification, going back to us, we have got the influx of data centers, retirement of coal and gas generators, created capacity concerns throughout the system. Rounding that out, there's enough water or there's enough energy, and it's possible to get more of both. But the transmission to get it where it needs to be isn't necessarily there in all cases. We've got market and regulatory pressures on our generation mix. Now that's the reintroduction of apex predators. Bear with me.
Okay.
So without wolves in the Northwest, the elk population grew to an unsustainable level. You got a loss of vegetation due to overgrazing, impacting bird and beaver populations. You had fewer trees for shade, fewer plants to control erosion, which made for a dirtier water system, right? So we're back at water. Similarly, prior to deregulation and the market as we know it today, federal, state, and local regulatory constructs, the electricity system was considerably dirtier as well. But the reintroduction of wolves reduced the elk population to a sustainable level, and we saw a reversal of those issues, cleaning up the water supply. Similarly today, pretty much all of the new generation, I think I can think of one exception in the Northwest that's being built, is carbon-free. We've got a clear parallel.
So you're saying enhanced geothermal is the wolf, the apex predator of the energy transition?
I was thinking of the gas plant that Idaho Falls is putting in, actually, but I guess
you said
example.
You said it was clean. I mean, I'm saying enhanced geothermal is the clean apex predator that's coming to help us.
Oh, I misunderstood. Yes.
No, I'm sorry.
I was thinking of the market and regulatory pressures as the apex predator, but I also know of a few people who will really enjoy the idea of their systems being apex predators.
Yeah, I cut you off. Keep going.
No,
you're at apex
good.
predators. In this biome, we're reintroducing apex predators, which are the policies.
I'm feeling like I'm not going to win this, but it's okay. I like this
You are
idea.
going to win this biome. We're gonna redo this. There's a biodome because I remember the biodome from my childhood.
I can only think of Pauly Shore when you say that.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes, exactly. Anyway, keep going.
There's what I considered an interesting parallel as well with respect to demand elasticity, which I felt like you might enjoy. There's some, but obviously not below a certain point. It's necessary to survive. I think there's an inverse correlation with supply, however, in the analogy, since if prices are too high or there's not enough water, it's potentially deadly to the environment or the individuals or the families and so forth, the consumers. If prices are too low or there's too much water, it encourages waste and creates an unsustainable ecosystem that's ultimately going to end up being self-correcting over time. Finally, I've got large-scale natural disasters as our price spikes. In a biome, you got an earthquake or tsunami that's going to result in near-term devastation, but you'll end up with new rivers or streams. Right? The transmission is going to figure itself out. they're created, a new balance emerges. Similarly, for the energy system, as they say, the cure for high prices is high prices. Since while they'll be financially devastating in the near term, you might see bankruptcy and the like, the price signals are supposedly will result in the building of new generation and transmission in order to once again get back in balance.
Do you have a proposal for what a hedging contract would be in the bio metaphor?
I think it would be an attempt to avoid a natural disaster, to mix my metaphors.
Is it like a canal? Is it just a canal? I'm adding a canal. Is that what a hedge is?
Yeah, I'd have to think on that. I don't know. You got me painted in a corner here, Dr. Byers. That was well done. I don't know. Any suggestions?
What do you think, Conleigh? What do you think? Is it a canal?
Well, I guess you want it to be something that doesn't actually change the fact that that natural disaster happened, right? But somehow you're protected from the effects of it. So yeah, maybe a canal could potentially be a good choice.
Or a big lake in both cases, right? Both the most effective battery we have today, and a great way to get water.
Might be a physical hedge.
Yeah, that's an excellent point.
Yeah.
A contract for a big lake.
Yeah.
The financial hedge in the bio metaphor might be extra challenging,
Yeah.
but maybe not impossible. We'll think on it.
Yeah.
I like it. So in this analogy, the electric system is like the water in a biome. That's what you're saying?
The electricity specifically is the water.
Electricity is the water in the biome.
Yeah.
Okay.
The system itself is the biome.
The system itself is the biome. The energy system's the biome. Correct. The electricity is the water of the biome. Love it. Okay. Anything else on analogies?
I think I've said enough.
I think that was a great analogy. We're going to use the biome. The water in a biome is the electric sector. I do have a special treat for everyone. I'm going to reveal at least a part of the actual ESSA World Cup. We're doing this live. It just came today. We have a glass insulator, right? That will end up serving as the crown of our ESSA World Cup. I'll have to figure out if I can get it etched with the champion's name. So if you win the ESSA World Cup championship tournament, you'll be able to display this proudly on your I don't know, your mantle on
I'll
your
have to build a mantle,
case
but it'd be worth
choice. It would be worth it. Absolutely. Look at this. It's beautiful.
It's beautiful.
So that is it's going to be an actual thing. It will cost me a lot to ship it to you. Especially if you win, Farhad. It'll cost me a lot to ship it to you. Maybe we can get S&P to actually pay for the shipment because, we'll see how it goes.
Right.
Okay. That's a grand trophy for a grand championship. Okay. Are we good? Thank you so much. The next episode will include a discussion of EVs, markets, and electric service with the founder of WeaveGrid, Apoorv Bhargava. But before we close out, I wanted to just say thank you to our wonderful hosts. I hope you feel seen, heard, valued, and appreciated. Conleigh, do you feel seen and heard?
Yes, thank you.
Good. Farhad, did you feel like it was worth it to get up on a Saturday morning again?
Indeed.
That means a lot, actually. It means a lot that you're willing to give up your Saturday morning in Australia for us. And Matt, do you feel seen, heard, valued, and appreciated? Is it good to be back hosting Public Power
Excellent
Underground?
to be back, and honestly honored to be a part of this with these wonderful people.
I mean, I love having you, but I'm not gonna lie. We'll be excited to get Almaz back for next episode because she is a star.
I don't blame you at all.
No, I know. I'm just kidding you. Thank you for doing this. I really appreciate it. Special thanks to our presenting sponsor, the Energy Authority, for making this show possible. If you want to feel seen and heard, try tea. To our listeners, while you aren't seen or heard, you are valued and appreciated. Roll on, enthusiasts. Roll on.
We started in hard times to bring us all into the laughter through thick and through thin for public power enthusiasts without and within.
Public Power Underground is a production of News Data and Seattle City Light. You don't have to be subscribed to News Data's weekly newsletter to get this podcast, but it sure makes the podcast make a lot more sense. The views expressed here are own and not the official views of Seattle City Light, Tacoma Power, S&P Global, News Data, NRU, Harvard University, or the organization of the guests also appearing on Public Power Underground. The Wall Street Journal, or PNUC. Today's episode was written and produced by Paul Dockery, Matt Schroettnig, Conleigh Byers, and Farhad Billimoria, and it's edited and published by the stellar team at Pioneer Utility Resources, with sound mixing by Lucas Smith and video editing by Brendan Delzer. Our theme song, Roll On Enthusiast, was rewritten, performed, and recorded by Aaron Guillory and Ian Bledsoe. You can find Public Power Underground on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Please share with the energy enthusiasts in your life and give us a rating and review on your app of choice if you enjoyed the content. It helps other energy enthusiasts like us find us. Public Power Underground for electric utility enthusiasts. Public Power Underground, it's work to watch.